Republic on the list of great books that you guys read?
Yeah.
So I'm a philosopher, and I just wanted to mention it's a little bit weird that I'm asking you to stay in the cave. Okay, so as Blake mentioned, I wrote a book called Ethical Loneliness, which is about practices of hearing and also failures of hearing. Ethical loneliness is a name for what happens when people are abandoned by humanity. And that could happen through genocide or crimes against humanity or systematic oppression or unaddressed racism, all kinds of things. So abandoned by humanity, and then on top of that, not truly heard when they testify about what happened or what it would take to rebuild the world. So ethical loneliness is a double loss or a double erasure. Abandonment compounded by not being heard. Now, people who attend talks around themes of ethics, empathy, and justice tend to think that human rights are good and atrocity is bad. Perhaps there's very widespread agreement about that as a general statement, even outside of audiences like this. So let's suppose we agree upon that. Human rights are good and atrocity is bad. What next? What's to be done in the face of the fact that for a long time now, people have tended to agree that human rights are good and atrocity is bad, and yet we're still living in a world where atrocity happens all the time and human rights are not experienced meaningfully by a huge number of people. How should we think about that? Who's responsible? Who's to blame? Of course, responsibility for conditions that allow that make atrocity a possible occurrence are complex to discern. Today, I want to focus on how those of us who care about justice hear or fail to hear what survivors of human rights abuses say, what they say about what happened to them, why it was wrong, how to fix it, and what they're now owed in recompense. That shifts our attention away a little bit from sites of atrocity toward the many locations in which response to harm can succeed or fail. In order to do that, I'm going to have to talk about some upsetting things. I'll be telling some stories of terrible things that human beings do to each other without going too deep into any one story, but it's possible you may hear things that upset you. It's not possible to avoid that because this is a talk about harm. So this is what I'll do. I'll talk about the reasons why we may hear well or badly, and why sometimes we fail to hear even when we're trying our best to listen. I'll talk about some examples where traumatized persons tried to tell stories and those stories were not heard in the way they wanted them to be heard. Since I'm a philosopher, I'll spend a little bit of time considering what this tells us about what it means to be a human being and what we can learn from that about what we owe to others. And then I'll wrap that up with some concluding thoughts. All of that will take about 40 minutes, and then we can discuss whatever it is you guys are interested in. Okay, so I'll start with some questions. What happens when institutions aiming to adjudicate loss impose loss of a different kind? When a speaker speaks in an institution designed for hearing, and an audience empowered to listen hears something other than what she says, who is responsible? What stories can and what stories cannot emerge from a legal trial, a truth commission, an archive of testimony, or even a conversation between friends? And what should that tell us about the power of testimony? My focus today will be on instances where a gap between what is meant and what is heard produces a kind of injustice that may have something to teach us about the fraught relationship between communication and loss as it surfaces in spaces designed for hearing. So, why do we fail to hear? Psychologist Ronnie Janoff-Woolman observes that when a human being undergoes a trauma inflicted by another human being, quote, the world is suddenly a malevolent one, not simply because something bad has happened to the victim, but because the world of people is seriously tainted. Trust in others is seriously disturbed, end quote. Such a violation damages a person's sense of her own self's boundaries and may destroy her trust in the world. Holocaust survivor Ruth Kluger adds, quote, for the sensation of torture doesn't leave its victim alone, never, not to the end of life. It isn't the pain per se, it's how it was inflicted. What matters is not just what we endure, but what kind of misery it is, where it comes from. The worst is the kind that's imposed by others with malicious intent. That's the kind from which no one recovers, end quote. Along those lines, torture survivor Jean Amery remarks on how infliction by violence by other human beings can destroy a self. He writes, quote, with the first blow from a policeman's fist against which there can be no defense and which no helping hand will ward off, a part of our life ends and it can never again be revived, end quote. Recovery from such harm can be difficult, at least in part, because the shattering of the initial view of the world as kind and caring cannot be undone. Those who work to recover from human-caused trauma often face a difficult choice between letting go of old assumptions about how the world works, in particular that it's benevolent and that selves are autonomous, and living with the frightening prospect of building a new world in which you have to give up the old security and admit vulnerability to harm. Susan Bryson, a survivor of rape, battery, and attempted murder, writes that trauma, quote, not only shatters one's fundamental assumptions about the world and one's safety in it, but it also severs the sustaining connection between the self and the rest of humanity, end quote. And she knows that from experience. If any of us are lucky enough to have remained intact and unviolated, we don't want to hear that no matter what we do, we could end up destroyed. That the fabric of holding the world together that we experience as relatively safe is very fragile. We don't want to know that, and so we may find it difficult to hear a story where that is the message. That's one complication in how we hear. There are others, which I'll discuss as I make my way through the stories that we'll talk about today. So, how can we hear well? Let me begin with a quote from the literary and queer theorist Eve Sedgwick. She writes, quote, "To read from a reparative position is to surrender the knowing, anxious, paranoid determination that no horror, however apparently unthinkable, shall ever come to the reader as new," end quote. Another less eloquent way of stating what Sedgwick says is, if you read reparatively, you open yourself to surprise, to the sometimes unwelcome sense that you do not already have at hand the tools you need for hearing and responding. Such an experience can be unsettling, and so we may understand why what Sedgwick calls paranoid reading so often predominates in critical scholarship. Paranoid reading is a kind of insurance policy against the disappointment that comes with wanting the world to be one way and finding that it is not that way. If, when you analyze the world, its people and events, you arrive at the analysis always already knowing that what you'll find is oppression, violence, and abuse of power waiting to be debunked, you won't be disappointed when that's what you find. One of Sedgwick's points is that if that's your technique, then in your search for the theory or structure that explains the objects of your focus, you may miss ambiguities that matter. In doing that, you may also inadvertently subscribe to a theory of communication as transparency, where what gets said means only what is said, and the truth makes things right. And if that's your belief, you may also, as Sedgwick notes, fail to note that uncovering abuse does not accomplish repair on its own. Sometimes it doesn't even help. Reparative reading opens a reader to surprise, to finding the world in a state she did not expect, for better and for worse. When Sedgwick uses the term reading, she's not only talking about what happens when we pick up a book, but what our practices of interpretation are in general. If you read or encounter the world in what Sedgwick describes as a paranoid way, you approach every occurrence as if you already understood what it is and what it will mean going forward. But if you read or interpret the world in a reparative way, you leave more room for uncertainty to speak to you, to tell you to look deeper at something that isn't immediately understandable or that doesn't fall directly into a set of pre-existing categories. That matters because persons open to being unsettled may, at certain times and in certain places, be most able to improvise new responses to harms that no pre-existing remedy fully comprehends. That will make a difference in an institution of justice like a court or a truth commission. It will also matter in your personal relationships. The self with the will to repair needs to be open to being interrupted, to hearing something other than what is expected. And that matters because some kinds of loneliness, some harms, and some injustices are made of a failure of hearing. Such failures may even happen in institutions designed for hearing, like courts, archives of testimony, truth commissions, a conversation, a doctor's office. When a speaker speaks in an institution designed for hearing, and an audience empowered to listen hears something other than what she says, it can be difficult to determine who is responsible for the failed communication, especially if we get stuck thinking that responsibility equates with culpability. When we do that, we think legal culpability gives us the whole breadth and depth of our ethical responsibility. And then we allow law to tell us the whole thing about how the world ought to be. But things are more complicated than that. If we think of responsibility not as legally defined blameworthiness, but instead as the duty to respond or to be responsive, that is, the duty to participate in building a shared world, then other possibilities present themselves. So since we're talking about failed communication, let's talk a bit about irony. Unless you and I possess between us a fairly wide array of shared meaning, I'm probably going to have to explain to you any attempt I make at irony because of the gap in irony between what is said and what is meant. If I assume you just know what I mean, we might end up in the situation Jonathan Swift found himself in when people thought his essay, A Modest Proposal, was a horrifying call to cannibalism, rather than a biting criticism of the average rich person's indifference to poverty. That's a danger attached to any use of irony, and perhaps most of us are fine with the risks. But part of my aim today is to discuss how the risks that reside in the gap between what gets said and what gets heard may weigh more heavily on some persons than others. For an example, let's go way back and start with some irony from ancient Rome. The Roman poet Horace begins one of his satires with this line. He writes, quote, "I happened to be going along the Via Sacra, thinking as I tend to do on some trifle, I don't remember what, and was entirely absorbed in it when a man whom I knew only by name ran up to me and grabbed my hand, saying, 'How are you, dear friend?'" End quote. To this man, Horace responds, "Pretty well, all things considered," and then he keeps walking, only to become aware that the guy's following him. So Horace, feeling annoyed, asks the guy whether he can be of help, but really he means, "Stop following me." The guy, hearing Horace's words, but not their meaning, answers, "Yes, you may be of help." Horace keeps walking. He speeds up, he slows down, but the guy sticks with him. Finally, when they pass by the Roman Forum, this guy, whose name we will never learn, but we know that Horace knows it, reveals that he has a court date and he wants Horace to come in and help him with his case. Horace replies that he can't stand standing up for that long in any way, he doesn't know anything about law. The guy, knowing he'll be found in contempt if he doesn't appear as scheduled, nonetheless decides to stick with Horace in the hopes of being introduced to some of his influential friends. One can assume that this man lacks the power, money, and influence that would add up to a successful court case, so he pins his hopes on Horace. However, as fate or satire would have it, as they continue on their journey, they happen to encounter the plaintiff in the suit in question, who accuses Horace's unwanted new friend of being a scoundrel for not being in court, and asks Horace to be a witness to his arrest. Horace agrees, mostly because he just wants to be rid of the guy. So, one of the many ironies in the story is that the guy wanted Horace to help him with his legal problems, and Horace does, but not in the way he would have wanted. An irony. Instead of standing up for him in court, he acts as witness to his arrest. I mention this example of Roman satire because it speaks to how law, power, and communication come together, and also to who the winners and losers in that mix tend to be. Let's move forward in time. It'll be a miracle if I don't spill that at some point. Okay. In 1980, toward the end of a 90-minute interview done for the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, an interviewer tells a woman named Hannah, "You were able to survive because you were so plucky." Hannah responds, "No, dear, no, I had no." And meanwhile, if you're watching the tape, the two interviewers are arguing between themselves off screen, momentarily ignoring her, and Hannah continues, "How shall I explain to you? That time I had already determined to survive, and you know what? It wasn't luck, it was stupidity." And at this, one of the interviewers laughs and calls out, "You had a lot of guts." And Hannah continues, No, there were no guts. There was just sheer stupidity. And then one of the interviewers stands up and turns off the camera and ends the interview. Failure to hear abounds in this exchange. The interviewer tells Hannah that she was plucky. She hears lucky and responds to clarify that luck had nothing to do with it. They don't catch the miscommunication, and so they state, in other words, what is the same thing, you had a lot of guts. Meanwhile, Hannah's trying to correct their misperception, to describe what really allowed her to survive, but that's what we don't get a chance to hear. We don't find out what it means to Hannah to survive through stupidity. Interviewers set up a scene for hearing, and then fail to listen, an irony. It seems wrong, somehow disrespectful, to call that irony, but that's what it is. Horace's friend wanted help with his legal case, and he got it, but not as he imagined. Hannah told a story for an archive, but the way in which it was heard may produce a story other than the one she would call her own. Hannah's interviewers seem to want redemptive stories about the resilience of the human spirit and the drive to live against all odds. Because that is what they want, that is also what they hear. Lawrence Langer points out that while there may be redemptive stories to tell, many times survivors of grave abuse do not marvel at the strength of the human spirit, especially not their own. Instead, they mourn its fragility when the isolated self has no support from the surrounding environment to validate it. So if we were to really hear what testimonies such as Hannah's try to convey, we might find ourselves face to face with our own responsibility as listeners who have the power to hear or fail to hear. Of course, those who are put in the place of hearer of testimony may have reasons for not hearing well. They may be constrained to adhere to the facts of the case or the established laws and procedures. They may have a political interest in a restorative discourse. They may think they only need to hear about bodily ailments or legal context. They may be overwhelmed by how far the demand for help exceeds the capacity to offer assistance. Or they may be protecting themselves from the trauma of hearing. After all, stenographers, interpreters, and journalists working on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder from listening to stories. So listeners have responsibility to hear well, but they may have conscious or unconscious resistances to hearing well. Janoff Pullman has argued, using studies and her own clinical work as evidence, that human beings have a need to assume that the world is benevolent and that responsible actions can lead to good outcomes. That's another way of saying that human beings want to be able to take existence for granted, and so they work very hard, sometimes to the point of denial of reality, to make of the world a place where they might do that. Dan Baron has shown in his studies of the descendants of Holocaust perpetrators and survivors a will to distance the self from a difficult truth. In one case, a man who had finally asked his father about his job as a train conductor in Germany during World War II learned, after his father's initial denial, that his father had once watched a large group of prisoners shot to death on a train platform. A year later, when Baron re-interviewed the man did not remember his father's disclosure or that he had repeated the story to Baron. Judith Herman calls this, quote, a double wall erected to prevent acknowledgement of the memory of crime. The fathers did not want to tell, the children did not want to know, end quote. This is part of how we shield ourselves from painful knowledge. It's also part of how we perpetuate the pain of those who lack the capacity to erect such mental shelter. James Baldwin puts it well, discussing race relations in the United States in his book, The Fire Next Time. He writes, quote, this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, for which I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know and do not want to know it, end quote. Baldwin recognizes that conditions for repair or reconciliation are not met, and beyond that few even recognize their absence. So if we think about Hannah, luckily for her, there's a second tape testimony, one taken 7 years later, that rather than ending abruptly, ends with someone thanking her for her story, and Hannah responding, you're welcome. Maybe I feel a bit better too. I unloaded a bit. That ending might leave us feeling good, as if something cathartic had occurred, and maybe the speaker had derived some benefit from speaking and being heard. It starts to undo how terrible it felt to watch the end of the first tape. But one can't listen to two interviews held 7 years apart, during which a survivor of grave harm narrates exactly the same stories in very similar ways, and not be moved by what it would mean to have those be the stories that underlie a self-sense of its own history. If testimony works, It's not because someone gets to tell a story once, exorcise it, and then move on. If hearing's meaningful, it has to be embedded in an openness, where what is said might be heard, even if it threatens to break the order of the known world for those who listen. In the second interview, we learn what Hannah meant by surviving through stupidity. Stupidity is her code word for hoping that someone she loved would survive. Imagine inhabiting that bleak view as your only fragment of hope and then surviving and finding it unrewarded. Anyone who labels her survival strategy plucky misses a deep source of harm that no amount of time, law, or justice could fully repair. Nothing fully repairs such a loss, but some approaches will do better than others at helping rebuild broken worlds. The person whose world and self have been destroyed will need to rebuild a sense of self, of her own sovereignty in the world. Of course, no one's autonomous and self-determining from the ground up. Each of us would literally have died if no one had taken care of us as babies and children. Beyond that, all of the kinds of things that made us into who we are, many of those are things we didn't get to choose, like the cultures and families we landed in, and the laws and practices of the communities where we grew up. Of course, we become who we are, part through our own power and work, but also in large part by who helped us and who didn't, and what local and non-local politics at the time of our birth were, not to mention love, luck, and misfortune. I mention this just so that we know that selves can be destroyed because selves are also built, and built cooperatively, by human relationships of various kinds. Rational, emotional, intentional, unwitting, chosen, and unchosen. Even if selves were more self-sufficient than this intersubjective definition would have us believe, it would still be the case that before a self could rebuild her own sovereignty, she'd need to feel safe. That, in turn, requires a surrounding world where safety is possible, though that's also what's destroyed by violence. A world, a cooperatively authored thing, can't be rebuilt by a person acting alone, especially not one with a destroyed self. It's the job of the wider world to help with the rebuilding. So a person whose world and self have been destroyed may need to rebuild a sense of her own sovereignty, but responsibility for offering conditions where that is possible ought to fall very widely. That is so not only because only very wide disregard allows for worlds to be destroyed in the first place, but because thinking of responsibility in terms of individual culpability or strictly legal accountability may mend discrete harms, but it doesn't fix a broken world. That is why, at the same time that a person whose world has been destroyed may need rebuilt sovereignty, the person whose world was left intact may need a bit of destruction of her own personal sovereignty. This claim can't be universalized in any simple way because we all carry with us varying amounts of damage and different levels of belief in our own autonomy. But I don't think it's too dangerous to say that a huge number of people could do with some destruction of their idea of the self's autonomy. Just a bit more awareness that the self's sovereignty is a fiction or a partial truth, and that the fiction can be as useful as it can be harmful. We'll return to that. For now, let's just mark that Dory Lau gives us 6 ways in which those who listen to traumatic testimony try to insulate themselves from hearing what it says. 1 is mental paralysis brought on by fear of merging with the atrocities. 2 is outrage and anger unwittingly directed at the victim. 3, withdrawal and numbness. 4, a flood of awe and fear, which is an impulse to endow the survivor with sanctity and keep her at a distance. 5 is hyper-emotionality, where the testifier is drowned in the listener's defensive affectivity. And finally, foreclosure through facts, which means only hearing what you already know. Okay, another story. Fiona Ross describes the case of Yvonne Kutwane, who in July 1996 testified to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I'll call the TRC, about a variety of forms of violation. In the print media, her testimony was condensed to her experiences of sexual violation. Reported as a story of rape, that framing was taken on and repeated in the Commission's 1998 report, and in a talk given at a conference on transitional justice at Yale University by Commissioner Wendy Orr. The case material from the Yale conference was then reproduced in a scholarly book by Martha Minow, and forms part of the basis on which other authors consider the effects on women of things like truth commissions. For instance, Priscilla Hayner's book on truth commissions. What Ross is telling of Kutwani's story shows is just how far out of the control of the speaker a testimony can spiral in the world of global journalism, the internet, and television. Minow's and Hayner's books are widely read. The transcript of Kutwani's testimony is not. It doesn't render anyone blameworthy for reading Minow or Hayner, but it does show who has more power over her story, Kutwani's story. Upon reading the transcript of what Yvonne Kutwani said, one's reminded of how much patience and respect the TRC commissioner showed so many who testified. Kutwani wanted to tell the story of her humiliation, and she did so on her own terms, which were sometimes difficult to follow. Her story was difficult to follow in part because she did not wish to tell the story that the commission most wanted to hear. One can read her testimony as an assertion of agency and a form of resistance to the expected narrative form. Also, perhaps, an attempt to reclaim herself by means of her own story. Some of the humiliation that Kutwani described did include sexual violation, but the point that she returns to over and over again is that she was dehumanized by young people the age of her children. Since she comes from a culture that respects its elders, that's what destroyed her world. In her words, quote, "It was so painful because I couldn't stand it, because these kids were young and they still had all the power to respect and honor me. They were just the same age as my children and what they were doing to me," end quote. So she was harmed by being sexually violated, that's true. But the story that she wanted to tell framed what happened to her in terms of a broader destruction of world. A TRC commissioner guided her to adhere to the expected form of TRC testimony covering recognized human rights abuses. So the TRC imposed a form but did let her tell her story. The larger world did not. In newspapers and books, her story is largely a story about rape. The hard irony here is that even when an institution designed for hearing uses procedures that silence some stories more than others, but even when a resistant story gets told and heard, the larger world may not be willing to hear it for what it is.